everybody. Welcome to the training, learning, and development community. Thanks for joining us today. We are talking with Danny Ortegon, or how do I say your last name, Danny? I'm sorry, I never even asked.
It's the last name officially would be Ortegon, but nobody uses those sort of Spanish pronunciations. So through our whole life, it's been Ortegon. So anything close to that, Ortegon, close enough.
Yeah, no, I know the feeling because I always get the hey Louis, and it's
yeah,
like, it's Luis. I went with Louis for a long time, but
yeah, I hear you.
We're talking with Danny today, and we're talking about leading e-learning projects. And I think you guys, let's see, we have some folks that are in already right now. Leslie is here, and Phil, Dorota, nice to see you. Christina, Perva, hey Cheryl. Thanks for joining us. Now, Danny we were just talking about our backgrounds and how long we have been in this space. And we've both kind of been around for a while, and we have stories to tell, of course. But I think that with Danny's background in particular, this conversation is going to be really, really important. It's going to have a ton of stuff for you guys to get value out of, because he's just been in the industry for a long time, and really like leading e-learning projects. That's kind of a big deal. Especially leading multiple e-learning projects. It's not like people get up, in the morning and think, I can't wait to take my e-learning today. So it is like something that, going at it on multiple times is that kind of experience is really significant. And so Danny is going to share with us lessons learned leading e-learning projects. And what I want to start with is I want to give you guys some context about Danny's background and the things he's done. We've been talking, and I even know him from Nick Floro, where they worked on a successful project together. And some of you may know Nick as being one of the most incredible sort of multimedia, like technology professionals out there in L&D. But Danny worked with him on a great project, which I'm not sure we'll have any time to really talk about today. But Danny, why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit about your background and your start into L&D and all that good stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I've been working in the e-learning space for more than 25 years. Prior to that, I was a hardware software integration engineer for several years. One of the things that got me into the whole learning space was I had a really great boss early on in an engineering world, and he challenged us all the time, and nothing was ever the status quo. And so he was always pushing us to try to do things in a more effective way and to not be worried about making mistakes. And that's not easy to do when you're working in a precise world. But one of the ways I got into the whole e-learning space, or to the learning space, was that being in a hardware group is we would design these devices, and we would literally, what they would call, throw them over the cube wall to the software folks and say, let them figure out how to program it and move on. And I remember that happened a few times, and it wasn't very effective. And I said to my boss, well, these folks are struggling to learn this, so much to train them. He says, that's a good idea, Danny. Why don't you train them? And I didn't know what training was. I didn't know what any of those things was. Long story short, I found space. I wrote up some materials. I put together a schedule. I worked with these folks, and it was successful. And I thought, well, hey, there's a whole career here possibly. I gotta explore this. So I dug around a little bit and started doing more things like that, and ended up contacting some folks and doing some research, and then got into a graduate program while I was working as an engineer. And then I got into a large bank in Chicago working to support the IT folks as a relationship manager.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so having a background doing some different things like that is really, really helpful too, because I think, establishing yourself within different verticals and being able to work with these types of technologies and tools, it does make a difference. And so I'm going to go ahead and just jump into some of these bullet points that you sent over. And, folks, if you had looked in the description, there were a series of bullet points that Danny was going to cover today that are related to those lessons learned. And one of the things that I really like about this is when you're talking about e-learning, generally, we always approach it, you think about the development piece or the tool piece or, just different things like that are more individual. But when Danny approached me to discuss this topic, he had things that are more project focused and more team and collaboration sort of, themed. And that was really, really different. So I do think that you guys are going to find value in some of this stuff. And one of the first topic that we were going to cover is a lesson learned was looking beyond advocating primarily for a specific tool or product or technology or trend. Why is that important, Danny?
Well, I think that's important because what I experienced was, or even early on, there was a lot of technology that was out there. In order for us as e-learning developers to learn them, we had to really dive deep. We had to learn the lingo and be very conversant on what these tools did. And it took a lot of time and effort. And often what happened is it takes so much time and effort that when we come to the point of supporting our internal clients or our customers, we're speaking in a language that maybe they're not understanding, and when it was early on in the e-learning world, that was okay. But I think, but it still was a bit of a challenge. It was okay. But I think over the last 10 or 15 years, the amount of technology in the e-learning space has just exploded. And the demand for online learning has really gone beyond, I think, what anybody would have anticipated. And I think what happens is things are so dynamic, things are moving so fast that often as e-learning developers, we learn the methodology, we learn the tool, or we have vendors or you have big tech companies that say, this is the tool, this is the solution. Let me put this template over your problem and your problems are solved. And I'm kind of exaggerating a bit, but I think that's what I experienced. And then when I was speaking and I had the time to speak to my customers, my internal customers, my clients, they're like, hey, Danny, that all sounds great, but I don't know what you're talking about because I'm focused on my sales and marketing team or my operations team. Are they able to function? And what are they doing well now? What do they need to do well? How can you help me bridge that gap? I mean, that's the level of technical issues that they're wanting to discuss. So I had to come in there and speak to them in a language that reflected what it is that they were doing. I couldn't throw at them, back in the day, authorware, director, some sort of multimedia tool, or hey, I want to bring this learning management system in. And like, what's the learning management system? I had some conversations with folks, and I go through this whole spiel and I say, first thing they said to me is, Danny, what's a vendor? And I don't think they were pulling my chain. I just think that I was speaking in the terms of a language that I understood, but perhaps they didn't understand. And even though, over the last year with COVID, everybody's getting online and everybody knows that they have to get online some way, I still think a lot of more traditional perhaps, but a lot of organizations are struggling, especially schools are struggling. How do we understand what's happening out there? And how do we get a good bang for our buck? And how do we know that you're helping us focus on the learning challenge? Because the whole goal here is to develop a learning solution that accurately reflects what the learning challenge is. It's not bring in the latest cool, technology and then make me use your template. Nor is it, I want to see all the great skills that you and your team have, Danny, because that's going to be really cool to you. It's really, how can you help me solve my problem?
Right. So are you just going after pretty much like, here's the problem I'm going to solve? I mean, is that really what you're kind of wanting to advocate as soon as from the get-go?
I think, yeah, I think it's more of how can I understand the problem that you have, the learning problem that you have? Wow. And what does that entail?
That's a significant distinction.
Yeah, I think, and working with Nick at SealWorks, he was a fantastic partner because Nick is extremely technologically savvy, but he did not come in when I brought him in with my client. He did not come in and say, I have this great solution. Just let me show you all the things that I can do, which was very different from a lot of the vendors and consulting and contracting firms that I've spoken to that just said, oh, yeah, we know what you're doing. We're going to put this gamified solution and everyone's going to be happy. And I'm like, no, I don't think you're listening. So understanding and listening and having that conversation is part of building a relationship so that you are partnering hand in hand as you go through and you're bringing in the best, developers, the graphics folks, the technology, but you are partnering with your customers or your clients to focus on the learning challenge with a new learning solution that truly reflects what their goals are, but also takes in the fact what the history was, what some of their concerns are, what some of their fears may be. And that's a sophisticated conversation. It's not just, we're going to give you this great solution and just pay us.
Right. So when you are leading these projects, I mean, how much of that energy or that effort really does end up, talking about the tool or the product or the technology? I mean, is it just is it a really minor piece, or does that actually ever come into focus in a significant way?
I think it's a significant piece, but it's not something that you open up with. I
Hmm.
really think you open up with, I'm here as a learning professional. I have a set of tools or methodologies that I can put to use to help you solve your problem. But I want to understand what your problem is. I want to understand how you perceive it, how your team leaders perceive it, even how some of your users perceive it, or maybe even some of the people that you perceive as best in class. And so, what does that mean to you? And how do you anticipate that looking? And what's going to change in your business practices? What's going to change in how you operate?
Yeah.
And have you thought about your budgets, and have you thought about the long-term effect of, once you become a digital provider or you're adjusting to a new tool, are you ready to maintain the budget and the resources to do that? And I think, Luis, you and I talked about earlier, are you ready to make mistakes?
Yeah.
Because you're going to make mistakes. Systems are going to go down. Everything that's on the cloud, of course, that doesn't mean they're not going to have problems, and maybe getting in the network or your content might glitch up. And that's a new reality for folks, I think. And even I think for folks that say maybe using a particular authoring tool that they're really comfortable with, and say, hey, we're just going to get a new tool, no big deal. But it's a new set of principles and ideas that you're working with. So there's a comfort level that you have to achieve.
Yeah. I'm going to throw this one at you just to kind of to reiterate the lessons learned piece. Did you ever jump into a situation where you were kind of more like too focused on the tool, or you presented that as kind of like, hey, yeah, I know the perfect thing. We're going to like just jump into this. I've got Camtasia, or I've got, Articulate or something. And yeah, has that ever happened to you?
Absolutely. I would work for one of the first organizations I worked for was a big financial services bank, and it was, it was a trust bank, and trust banks are these very buttoned down organizations. They have a fiduciary responsibility to the super wealthy clients, and they had decided that they weren't going to do instructor-led training for their clients that were using their software. They were going to develop some other solution, and my proposal was, let me help you develop task-specific online help. And they're like, well, what is that? And well, I have this great tool from RoboHelp, which is a really old term. I don't even think it exists anymore. It's going to be very focused on when someone clicks through a particular function or feature, I can give you the information that they need, and they can move forward. And they all kind of nodded. And then I went back with my boss, and I said, to my boss, how did that go? And she's like, you got to go there, and you got to meet with them. You got to have coffee with them. You got to meet their teams. You have to explain to them in terms that they understand that you're going to help them help their clients use their tool and be more effective in their jobs. And that's more than just a one-person conversation.
Yeah.
And that's that was my first idea, first entree into the idea of, I can have all the cool technology, or I know how to put a design document together, or I know how to survive a design review with some pretty aggressive IT folks or pretty aggressive finance folks. But am I going to be able to communicate that message to the operational folks that are going to get the support that they need from me? And do they know what that means?
Wow. Yeah. And that is a really, really relevant point. And it's a great segue into kind of your next bullet point, where you're talking about using a more customer focused and collaborative approach when sharing and communicating the e-learning skills that you and your team can bring to a learning project. Why is that important?
Well, it's important, I think, because what we touched on a little bit early on is that we as e-learning developers can know a tool and know the methodology, know what it takes to make it happen. And I call this your KSEs, your knowledge, your skills, and your experience. And you can speak about it in terms that people from the Learning Guild would understand, that your other friends in the ID world, maybe some project managers. But how do you communicate those skills to your customer so that they understand what skills are you going to bring to bear and why that's important? Like I said, I had a conversation with one of the founders of an organization, and the first question I had from him is, what's a vendor? And he wasn't pulling my chain. He's just like, I'm not following your jargon and your lingo. And this is a very bright guy who'd spent a lot of time and effort over the years building this methodology to help students learn how to think critically and write, documents, or I'm sorry, write papers. And they wanted to bring this whole curriculum online. So he knew that he needed to get online, but he also knew that there's a lot of stuff he didn't understand, and he was not going to be comfortable going forward if I didn't speak to him in a language that made sense to him. So if I or my team have all these great knowledge, skills, and experiences, or we've worked with the latest technology, or we've worked with, mobile-based authoring tools, or we've worked with other authoring tools, it doesn't mean anything to them if I can't communicate to them what tools I can bring to bear to help you solve your problem in a language that makes sense to them without being condescending.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've seen that too, like where people that were stakeholders in a particular project did feel like, whoever was leading an e-learning project, the way they were communicating it did feel condescending to them, because they don't know what they're talking about. And if you're throwing around a bunch of terminology that is like foreign to somebody, like, vendors, that can make you feel like you're just somewhat ignorant about things. And that's definitely the wrong way to go.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples about that? Like, maybe using Nick's, your partnership with Nick, and how that might have been more customer focused and collaborative ways that you were able to achieve that?
Well, one of the nice thing about working with Nick, and I think I would have to say Nick is an exception. He is extremely technically competent and has a very technically competent tool, but he also understands that he's going to collaborate and get involved in a project, and he's not looking to just get in and get out. And I think he was the exception to the rule, because when I was working with this customer on transitioning from where they were, it was kind of this curriculum that they use in school systems, and was like 12 binders, and they were in the top 10 school districts in the country, and this methodology that worked really well. A lot of the early conversations I had with potential vendors or contractors were, we'll gamify that for you, Danny. You guys will be really happy. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're not understanding the challenge. And there were other companies that just said, yeah, we know how to do that. We've done that for Encyclopedia Britannica, or we've done that for some big insurance company, and we'll just take all your content, we'll digitize it, and we'll break it up in such a way that it's going to be so cool and so easy. And Nick was the first one to say, can I sit in on one of your teachers teaching what this methodology is and see what it's like? Nobody asked that, right? So he flew from Philadelphia to wherever they were holding that, and he experienced it and saw it, and came back and asked me questions. And I set up a conversation with one of the founders, and Nick asked him questions about what it is that you were doing, what he really liked, and what he learned from that. Because I think people didn't realize at the time that this was a blended solution. You had your teachers on one side, you had your students on the other side. And even though they had a paper-based solution, it was a blended solution. And what we're trying to do and at the end was translate that into an online experience. That's a very sophisticated thing to do. And the way you're going to learn what that is by having a conversation and observing how that happens for teachers and students, right? And I think, hopefully I answered your question. I think what I found was there were a lot of, technology, e-learning type folks or consultants that didn't want to dig in and have that conversation. They just wanted to have a solution so they can move on to the next project. And really it was about a partnership.
Right. Can you detail a little bit more about, like, maybe for some other projects where that collaborative approach was important? Like how did you manage that collaborative approach?
Sure. I worked with an online college a few years ago. They were transitioning from an old learning management system to a new learning management system, something that they had, and they're strictly online college. It's something that they had never done before. And I was tasked by the president of the university to be his eyes and ears. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to learn, but I didn't want people to perceive me as being a spy, right? But I also knew that transitioning from one platform, whether it's in a school environment or it's a corporate environment, there's a whole bunch of layers that are going to have to happen when you make that transition. And I needed to develop a relationship where I can have a conversation about with the trainers, with the technology people, with the marketing people, with the folks who are working with the users and the administrators, and what that meant to them to let go of the world that they've been in the past to this new world, and what some of their concerns were, and to have careful conversations and try to understand what those concerns were, so that I could get a sense of how things were going right now, and can have a prediction of how they might be changing and what some of the concerns are from people, without disrupting the whole apple cart, without coming in and saying, I'm the expert and just, you'll get over it and you'll move on to your new system. I think there was a lot of adaptations and a lot of changes to the people and the processes and the business practices that we had to have a conversation about. And just to even broach that idea that we're going to think about how you operate and how you function as a business and how that's going to change. I think that's different than how a lot of companies out there might approach it.
Interesting. So you kind of really should try to embed yourself in there. And then, speaking to one of your other points, one of your other bullet points is, you say, think about and assess your customer structure from both an organizational and an individual perspective.
Yeah. And what I've done is, when I had a class in graduate school by a professor from Loyola University of Chicago, and it was about managing through change. And he had a model called Model A, Model B, and Model C. And the whole thing was, how do you describe an organization or a group or a company or people that are moving from where they are right now? So let's say they have a learning solution, to where they see the ideal learning solution being in the future. Mm-hmm. And below that, which isn't talked about much, is what's getting in the way. What's getting in the way of you moving from where you are now to where you want to be? And the underlying the whole thing about that is, as you moving through change, because change is a very difficult thing for people. And then this model, it works to kind of give you a framework of understanding and starting the conversation to, let's say you have a learning solution right now that's based strictly on computer-based solutions, or an online tool that's a web-based approach. You don't have that much of the technology operating in the mobile world or in your iPhone world, whatever, and you're going to move there. And on paper, or from a vendor's point of view, sounds great. We're just going to come up with a new authoring tool. We're going to move forward and we're going to adapt all that stuff. But you have to kind of understand where people are now with their business practices, their organizations, how they do their jobs, and what their concerns are, because what's going to happen is you're going to get to that. Your goal is to get to where you want to be. And as they transition and move forward, there are things that are getting in the way. And the things that get in the way are kind of your culture. What's your culture? Is your culture going to adapt to this new way of developing a learning solution and training your users? Are there people that are very fearful? Are you having conversations to kind of pull that information out? Are there people that are really good at supporting the learning and the way it exists today, that you might want to pull some of that knowledge up and adapt it to the new way? And are there things that are kind of written down, like these are your job descriptions for how people operate, but in reality, people do things in different ways, right? Mm-hmm. So people that get things done, it might not be written down and not be part of the job description. It might not be part of the business practices, but that's how people function today. And are we taking that into account as you move toward your new solution? Because in some cases, things that seem easy or straightforward, it's very difficult for them to happen, because we haven't had those conversations of what might be getting in the way. Is there a cultural issue? Is there some folks that are fearful? Are people struggling with, like, if we have to get this new learning solution out there, how are we going to train our users? What does that mean? Are we going to have is it going to be asynchronous training? We're going to have synchronous training. Are we going to put paper, online, kind of job aids? But what are we going to do to get people to understand what's going to happen? Are we going to have workshops? I mean, a lot of folks have that, but I think the underlying part of that is, are we talking about this? Are we discussing it?
Right.
Are we sharing this information? Because I think if you're not digging through, all those things kind of build up, and eventually it hinders or slows people down from moving to where they are now to where they need to be, because there's a lot of fear and uncertainty. And you have to have those difficult questions. And not that you're going to have a question that's going to put people on the spot, but you have to have a conversation. You have to be collaborative. And that is all based on early on building relationships with the founders, with the leaders, with the frontline folks, with the users, and helping them recognize that you're there to collaborate with them, to be consultative with them, and that you don't know everything, but you're there to help facilitate the conversation.
Right. No, this is great stuff. I think that these are things that we rarely ever even come across in these conversations that we have here on TLD Cast, and I think that we sort of brushed up against it last week when we were talking to Judy Borovich, and
Right.
and the conversation we sort of had about change management and how L&D folks should have some experience with that, and it sounds like this last point of yours is kind of related to that. So, is that something you had to learn the hard way, or how did you come across like knowing, okay, learning is change, and change can like really affect a culture like negatively, and you have to be able to manage that. Is that, how did you, what experiences did you have that
I think it happened to me kind of on the job, and happened to me personally. When I was brought in to support the relationship managers in the financial services organization as a relationship manager supporting some of the bank IT folks, there were folks that were supporting the back end IT work, right? And these poor people were stuck in a data center back then, or stuck in a room somewhere. And then there are folks that are dealing with, who are IT folks who are dealing with people's network and PC issues. Mm-hmm. So they needed to understand that they couldn't just stay in their little space around their computer monitors, around their network rooms, whatever. They needed to interact with people who are on the banking operations side, who could be very demanding, who could be very pushy, or could be under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress. And so for me, I was like, well, these folks these people that I'm supporting, these IT folks, are going to have to change. And how do I help them change? And you can't make people change, but you can facilitate a conversation about what it is that they have to do in their new roles, or what they have to do in their existing roles, and maybe do it better. And what's maybe slowing them down, what's concerning them, what skill sets do they need to develop. And in order to have that conversation, I think it goes back to having a relationship. I had to come in there vulnerable and say, hey, I don't really know what it is that you guys do for the people in the operations side, or I don't know what you do in the data center, but I know that your bosses have tasked me to have a conversation to help you improve and become more efficient. So what might that be? And to really, it was doing a needs assessment. And when you're doing a needs assessment of, where people are now, where they want to be, you're realizing that it's more than just me showing up as the expert, right? Mm-hmm. I could put together a whole curriculum for you, and then at the end of 3 months, we'll see where you are. And it really was having this detailed conversation about what's working and what's not working, and what are they willing to try? What are they willing to do? And one of the things that we're really interested in doing is negotiating. How do I negotiate when I go out with a partner-facing or a user-facing person on the trading floor, or a user-facing person in the operations world who works in a very demanding world because their clients demand, support and success, and they're not going to take too kindly to me saying, yeah, the network's down and we'll have it up in an hour or so, right? So how do I have a conversation with them where I don't lose face, and they're not so upset at me that they think I'm not going to be able to meet their needs? And so it kind of became like a negotiation. You're going to have a negotiation with these folks to say, look, we recognize that you're trying to support your customers. We're trying to support you as our customers. Here's what we can do as an alternative. We'll put you in a computer room, or we'll give you a new computer, or we'll give you a different access in a different way to the network. But trust us that we're going to do that. And we recognize that you have a challenge, and our challenge is to make you happy. But to have that conversation, I think, is that kind of gray area, because I think often, the caricature is, the grumpy IT person comes in and just says, oh, you're just a terrible user. You don't know what you're doing. And then the user looks at the IT person and says, wow, that person wasn't very friendly and he didn't help me at all. So,
yeah.
right.
And Christina here has a great comment. She's saying that many developers are quite outgoing and excellent communicators. We only find that out when we invite them out of their offices.
Yeah.
That's been my experience too.
I would agree. I would agree. Yeah. And I think it speaks to culture. Is there a culture, or is a way of doing business that allows your developers to have those conversations with people? Or is it more like, here's your task, you have so many hours, so many weeks, go knock it out, and don't bother the people that are dealing with users or dealing with clients?
Right. I have a great question in here from Dorota, and I just want to add, anybody out there in the audience, if you guys want to, if you have any questions at all or any comments, go ahead and drop it in chat or drop it in the Q&A area. This is a great opportunity to hit up Danny and ask him about leading an e-learning project. But Dorota is asking how to build or improve your authority or credibility when you lead a project, but you don't have a formal project manager or management job title in the company. How do you highlight the importance or urgency with other people so that they can complete their part in the project that she's leading or responsible for? I think it's a great question.
That's a great question. Yeah, I that's a complex one, because I'm assuming that perhaps, the culture that you're working in, or the organization you're working in, is not giving you the official titles to make that happen. So it really, I think, comes to your own personal leadership abilities to have a conversation with your team to say, here's who we are, here's what skills that we can bring to bear, here's the challenge that our customer has. How will we best meet that, and how can we crystallize the information to go have a conversation with our customers and to build a relationship with them? Because your goal is to either build a learning solution or improve address a learning challenge, and to give them some sense of success more than what they're having. And you're probably not going to get the official recognition for that. But I do think if you make a personal connection, and if you put yourself out there to have that conversation, you're more likely to get closer to that. And I don't have an easy answer for it. It kind of, you have to try things out, and you have to try to, sit down with people and say, hey, we really want to support you. I don't have the official titles to, or maybe official support to do that, but I know how to do it. I know what I can do to get us closer to that goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The one thing that I know from experience is when I've been in situations like that, it really ends up kind of coming down to lunch. Like just getting people out and saying, hey, you want to go grab a cup of coffee, or do you have any time for me to, can we have lunch together? Things like that, where you actually have to assert yourself,
right,
like at a personal level, and build those relationships, so that, like, although you may not have the the title or or the credibility yet, but at the very least making those connections where all of a sudden you have a friend,
right,
in these situations that might help. But yeah, that is a tough one, and I think it's pretty common. But yeah, I've heard it from lots of people. It's like coffee, lunch,
right,
anything just to get in there.
Yeah, and I'd say, you asked earlier, so how did I know? Like when I kind of made a mistake, or I realized that what I was doing wasn't working, was early on when I worked in a financial services organization. One of the things that my boss's boss says, Danny knows a lot about technology and learning, but he needs to have coffee with people and talk to them. And my first thought was, why do I want to have coffee with those guys? I don't know those guys, right? They'll listen to me if I just call them up on the phone or I send them an email, right? And I didn't realize the power of the personal relationship. As you said, have lunch, have coffee, and listen. Right. And listen and try to understand and be vulnerable and allow folks to communicate with you. To me, it was more like, I don't want to have coffee with those people. I'm too busy. Right.
Yeah. And it's tough too. Like it's intimidating, right?
It is.
Especially if you're in a corporate environment and you might be, you're like, okay, I need to really get to know this person so I can, have some decisions made. It might be somebody that, leads a different department. And so that can be a little scary, but, it is, I think that ultimately you kind of just have to go for it
Right.
and hopefully things will work out. Yeah. So, I just want to know a little bit more about you, Danny. So like, what are you
Okay.
up to now? What other projects have you been working on? And can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I'm pursuing a few projects right now. It's kind of been a lag since the COVID year, and trying to have conversations with people, and people have reached out to me from different aspects of my experience, and it's been a little bit tough because if I'm not in front of people, it's very difficult for me to have a conversation with people. And it's either it's an email, it's a text, or it's a note on LinkedIn. I like to think that I bring a multiple level of skills to the table. Someone reached out to me a couple of weeks ago, and they wanted to do kind of a needs assessment on what training would need to be done for particular jobs in a particular organization. And what I saw that is pretty straightforward. It's basically kind of a career development conversation. And it's a way of saying, if you're in this job as a salesperson, or if you're like a senior salesperson, or if you're like the sales manager, there's a certain skill set you're going to have to bring to the table. And if you have those skills, how do we train the skills to get to the next stage? And so I had some couple conversations with them, and I was able to speak to that because I've experienced that working with a lot of different companies. But I think what they were looking for is they wanted me to have a portfolio of all the ways that I did that in the past. I didn't have that portfolio because that was just part of what we did. That's just part of the job. And so I'm trying to separate out, what skill sets can I don't want to say monetize, but what skill sets can I market based on the skill sets that I've done besides like product management, project management, development. And often what happens, like, and I'm sure Nick can speak to you about this, is when you're developing a new methodology for a digitized solution, you're doing everything, right? You're doing design, you're doing development, you're doing testing, you're wireframing things up. Everybody's involved, and it's all hands on deck. And it's kind of hard to kind of put that into, well, let me put this in the portfolio to show you that I did all this testing and QA stuff, even though it wasn't part of my job, but I knew it was important to do. So it's those types of conversations where I'm trying to help people understand the things that we're talking about today, which is consulting and collaborating to get a project done is kind of where I can offer value, but it's not something that I can put together in a portfolio and say, this is exactly how I did it. It really would be a case study. I'd be happy to share it as a case study, but it's not something that's easily quantified. So that's where I'm kind of struggling. And I think just kind of the hangover effect of COVID is to get connected to folks.
Yeah, no, I totally get the challenge. I totally get that. Like, because you're just in it all the time and having to even for myself, just like what my background is, I've done a bunch of different things, and it's hard for me to think about, just sort of articulating the specifics. It's not really like, you just want to work.
Right.
It's
right.
what you do. Right.
Right.
And
right.
I know that there's so many other people in the community that have that same challenge. And it's like, they don't even really understand the relevance of their experience. And I kind of get that from you in your case too. Like every time we have a conversation, I'm like, oh my gosh, you have done that, and you have done that, and you've done that, and you have like a really, really incredible background, a ton of experience. And, and what Nick had mentioned to me was that you were really interested in sharing your experience with people. And that's why I am, glad that you're wanting to be a part of the community. And I know this isn't going to be the last conversation that we'll have on.
Well, thank you, Luis. I really appreciate that. I think you guys, I think TLDC, I observed some of the events earlier this year, and it was refreshing because, like you said, you're having conversations with people to try to learn and pull out some nuggets of wisdom. In order to do that, you have to kind of put down I'm the expert on XYZ tool. Let me just pontificate to you. And that doesn't happen. You really truly have conversations, even with your community days. People are bringing, I think, fantastic nuggets of knowledge and information, and then willing to listen and to gather that. I think that's a very unique space, and I think it's going to pay off because I think you'll probably notice on social media and in the learning development stuff, there's a lot of conversations about being collaborative. There's a lot of conversations of being consultative, a lot of conversations on how do we get beyond just being order takers, right? And because I think that was the biggest thing that I felt kind of negative, and from people I see in kind of the learning development space, they're in bigger organization. I don't want to just be an order taker that sales says, go build me a customer service training course. I'll see you in 3 months. Right? I think it's more than that. I think, and it's difficult. I'm not saying it's easy. It's difficult. And to find that kind of niche and fill it, and then, move on to the next project. And I think years ago, somebody mentioned, I was thinking about careers and where things were going. And they said, and their prediction was for careers, it's going to be like making movies in Hollywood. Everybody gets together, they make a movie, you have skill set from across the world. You make your movie for 6 to 12 weeks or whatever. It's a success. And everybody moves on to the next project where they all get together and they make a movie and move forward. And I think that's kind of how things are probably going to go, especially with people working still remotely, right?
Yeah. No, and it's just really important for me to have dialogue, right? To have conversations, just because, just digital and even social media can be really, I don't know, I feel like isolated sometimes. In fact, I don't participate that much because it doesn't feel, I don't know, it doesn't feel as authentic. And so it's one of the reasons why I like this. And I'm just totally about like broadcasting and, conversations with everybody that I can. In fact, you're going to see May is already completely booked with showcases, and June is almost filled up. And so that's my aim, is to kind of, talk to people like you, and hopefully, Elizabeth and Christina, maybe you guys just, come onto the broadcast and we have these dialogues, and hopefully it helps you discover a little bit more about yourself. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Danny, I want to book some more time with you. Let's talk about.
Thank you, Luis. I hope this added value. I know sometimes I could be the old guy rambling based on my experience, but it's been a lot of fun, and you've done a terrific job, and you have some very talented people doing some very talented work, and the fact that they're willing to share is huge. I think that's huge.
It absolutely is. I'm really, really, I'm really lucky to be a part of this community. And I'm surprised sometimes that I'm even up here in front of everyone, like in on it. So, hey, Danny, is it okay if I post your LinkedIn profile?
Absolutely. Sure. I'd be happy to
connect with you.
Happy to
and
follow up.
I can't say enough, you guys, if you guys have anything, like Danny knows a lot of stuff. He's been around. So leading e-learning projects, that's like, that's a big deal. So if you want to hit him up, connect with him. People can throw questions at you, Danny.
Sure, absolutely. Happy to connect, happy to share, happy to say if I don't know the answer. So I'm happy to connect, because I think that's what it's about.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, Danny. I am going to go ahead and close the broadcast out, but we'll get you next time. I'm going to message you, and let's come up with some more topics to talk about later.
Thank you, Luis. I appreciate the opportunity. Have a great day,
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.